Have you heard the one about the shopkeeper in New York City in 1870, riding westward to his cousin in Colorado, and the U.S. post worker who then went riding westward to deliver the letter? No? Well, that's because it's not really much of a joke. It's just me finally acknowledging the very bad pun of this podcast's name. I'll go ahead and give a moment of silence for everyone to let out some collective groans and roll their eyes at me. I think that'll do. Welcome to the Riding Westward podcast. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. This month we talk with Professor Cameron Blevins about his recent book, Paper Trails, the U.S. Post and the Making of the American West, published by Oxford University Press in 2021. We will also mention briefly the associated digital history and mapping website that goes with the book, gossamernetwork.com. So once and for all, we are finally going to talk about both writing westward and riding westward. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, allow me to take a moment to explain a bit about writing westward and myself. Each episode features a conversation with people writing about the North American West: historians, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, sociologists, and others. By showcasing their work, I hope to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who call it home. If a writer or topic intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please do subscribe, share links with friends, leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're using to listen, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and send in some feedback. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and an Associate Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation, with me playing role of host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all tasks for which I have no training. But I am passionate about the North American West, so this difficult work is well worth the excuse to read more books and talk to interesting people. At the end of each episode, I'll include a little bit more information about me and my scholarship, and about the Redd Center, our public programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. With that, let me introduce a little bit more about today's guest and why we're talking to them. Cameron Blevins is Associate Professor in the History Department at the University of Colorado, Denver. He is a historian and a leader in the growing field of digital history. In his recent book, Paper Trails, the U.S. Post and the Making of the American West, Blevins masterfully integrates his usage of digital mapping and data analysis with traditional archival research to reveal not just how the U.S. Post grew westward in the mid to late 19th century along with the rest of American expansion, but how it facilitated that expansion. The promise of cheap, reliable, and accessible mail delivery allowed military forces and posts to operate and more efficiently extend state power in the West. It allowed a highly mobile and transient Western population to make and maintain connections with family, friends, business partners, and others across expansive geographies and rugged topographies. And it served to integrate far-flung Western locales and their populations into national, social, cultural, political, and economic networks and systems. It may not be flashy, but Blevins convincingly reveals how important the U.S. Post was to the American West. This is an excellent case study in how careful historians can take topics that regularly appear in the background of history, but bringing them to the foreground and piecing together just how influential they were in building and supporting and steering those more prominent and familiar historical narratives. Professor Cameron Blevins, welcome to Writing Westward.
Hey, Brendan, thanks so much for having me.
I really enjoy topics and books that take topics that seem on the surface to be mundane or somewhat unassuming, but then a scholar opens them up and reveals unexpected, outsized influence of the topic. And the U.S. Post, mail, doesn't sound like the spiciest or most exciting or revelatory of topics, but you very convincingly prove otherwise. So tell us a bit about how you came to this topic. And I'm kind of curious if you had a skepticism of the topic or its importance when you started off, or if you were convinced from day one.
Yeah, I feel like the subtitle for the book should have been "The U.S. Post." It's not as boring as you think, maybe, or something like that. But no, it's a similar feeling on my end, where I've always been really fascinated by the kind of mundane, daily, almost hidden structures that shape, our lives. And in this particular case, the U.S. Post was really one of the most important of those daily structures for 19th century Americans and Westerners in particular. And so I kind of came at the topic as a graduate student, and I was not actually interested in the U.S. Post per se, but I was really interested in Western geography and trying to map out where people were moving to across the region during the 1800s, which is actually a very difficult thing to do because we don't have a lot of great information and data on a kind of year by year basis. And so I stumbled into the idea of using post offices to try to serve as a kind of proxy for people who are living around there. Once I actually started looking at that, though, I started to realize that post offices were more than just a proxy. They were actually phenomenally important institutions in local communities. And then that opened the door to this kind of larger research project of looking at how this network and this system really did structure the Western United States and its history.
So you're interested in mobility, but there's not a data set to, especially, mid to late 19th century, people aren't just moving around the West. They are moving all of the time and often staying in one place. And we'll get to some of the stories of some of the characters you introduce, but they're somewhere for a few months and then somewhere else. And you trace this through letters and some other things, but that's for one family, right? You needed a big data set to try to track. So the post offices and that federally organized data is what you landed on.
Correct. And I started when I was a graduate student trying to collect that data myself. There are these rolls and rolls of microfilm that are housed at the National Archives that, have information about every post office in the United States, when it opened, when it closed. And as you might imagine, that is pretty laborious labor there, as it were. And fortunately, about after a year or so of kind of trying to do that myself by hand, I came across the work of a postal historian and stamp collector named Richard Hellbach, who had spent decades of his life effectively doing just that, building a database of post offices, about 166,000 total, covering all of U.S. history up to the 1990s. And it was this remarkable source of information. Unfortunately, Richard Hellbach passed away kind of before I was able to actually discover his work. But fortunately for me, his wife was still selling this database online. And so I, sent her $80, and a couple of weeks later, a CD arrived in the mail that was probably the best $80 I think I've ever spent, and really became the basis for a lot of my analysis and my work for the book.
Oh, that's great. And was he a professionally trained historian or just an
Actually, his
enthusiast who?
background was more in geography, but he, from my understanding, is really one of the major leaders kind of in the stamp collector and postal historian community. He founded the major kind of postal history journal for enthusiasts. And so was a really influential guy. And it's really, I'm constantly kind of thinking I would have loved to have met him and at the very least kind of thanked him for all of his work.
Yeah, we all build off the work of others. And so that's interesting that, you I don't know how many more years you would have had to taken to kind of rebuild the database that he ended up having provided you, but I'm glad that hopefully saved you some good time. You introduce your book. You have a little method on notes in the front, which isn't something we see very often, but it's because you are using some very different methodologies, and you describe this as a work of digital history. Can you explain for listeners what that is?
And I'll try not to get too academic here. Digital history is, at a basic level, just using computers and technology to study or communicate or teach about the past. And this can encompass a whole lot of different stuff. So this can be a library taking some of its paper collections and scanning them and making them available online, or it can be something like using text analysis to look at, millions of documents, or in my case, using spatial data sets to map out patterns over time. And that's mainly what my kind of area of digital history focuses on, is this historical geography. And so I realize a podcast medium is not the best for trying to convey visual patterns, but what I ended up using was taking Richard Hellbach's database and then using that to map out on a year-by-year basis the entire geography of the US postal system. And so you can imagine tens of thousands of little dots on a map kind of expanding into different areas on a year-by-year basis. And being able to map out this huge network and get a sense for the scale and scope of it, but also some of the spatial patterns that were happening in the Western United States, led to a lot of really important insights for me to understand the role that this system was playing in the region.
So there's things that you came to, or truths you discovered that you would not have been able to do without using these digital tools. It's just too much data to visualize. And that's really kind of the power of digital history. And as you mentioned, a part of digital history might be digitizing resources, but that's kind of the lowest hanging fruit, right? It's the real power is
well, some archivists would probably beg to defer. They might say it's actually the hardest or highest hanging fruit, but point taken, yes.
But that's something I can do and that I can
Right.
access, right? But it takes a special skill set to then actually crunch data and use digital tools to teach us new things. I'll mention for listeners, if you go to the show notes or our website, we'll link to it, but you have a companion website, gossamernetwork.com. And if people are driving, don't pull this up on your phone at a stoplight, because people will start honking at you. But it's really fascinating to look through these moving data visualizations, and it's useful to kind of have to maybe have pulled up on a screen as you're reading. Of course, then the book does have a lot of maps. The website is then hosting moving maps that move, and you can scrub back and forth through time. But how do you explain to us the challenge then of taking this geographic data crunching that you've done, and not just translating it into maps, but translating it into narrative and into historical analysis that we can sit down and read without needing any kind of, without maybe even needing the companion website, or without needing any digital skills of our own?
Yeah, and the number of maps was a constant headache for the poor people that were laying out the book at Oxford University Press. There's something like 60 or 70 figures in the book, which they're not quite used to with most history monographs here. But the way I've always thought of it, at least how this is at least played out in my own work, is that studying something like the US Post, it was this massive, massive entity. It was the largest communication network really in the world, the most expansive postal system in the world. It had in the 1890s about 2.5 times as many post office locations as there are today. And so the mapping side of this, the data analysis, really helped me wrap my head around the larger shape of this network. It's really, really difficult to get a sense for just, again, the scale of something like that with 75,000 post offices without trying to zoom out, to 60,000 feet and try to see some of these larger patterns. But the flip side of this is that none of us typically experience networks and systems at that scale, right? And that's the case for 19th century Americans as well. And so for me to really understand what role did this network play in the lives of individual people, that's where I had to drill back down to kind of the floor level here and go into the archives and look at the letters and writings of Westerners who were living, in the middle of Arizona, for instance, and how they were using the mail to subscribe to half a dozen newspapers or send letters to their sister in San Diego, or send money through the mail. So all the ways in which individual people were interacting with this network was on a much more local kind of level that required more traditional archival research.
So the data, the maps, that gave you a framework, but it didn't tell you. It told you some stories, but not with any humans with names. So more traditional archival research that helps you then kind of build on that network and then tell stories through it, or use those stories to help us make sense of these maps and the data and everything.
Exactly, yeah. And I think there's maybe a common misconception, or a tension at least, with how people see digital history and some of these more data heavy approaches to studying the past. And I think there's a misconception that that's, all there is, or that people who are doing that are just caring about some of the larger patterns. And it's really a combination of those two scales of analysis for me, which is where I arrived at some of the, major kind of conclusions. And what I was proudest of with my work was being able to move back and forth between these two scales, right? Mapping a data set is not going to replace going into the archive at the Huntington Library and spending days reading letters, right? Those two things work in conjunction with each other.
I want to try to pull questions for us to chew on from as much of your book as possible. But first, maybe we need to talk about the US Post in really broad terms. I think we generally take it for granted. I don't think people think about the US Postal Service very often or critically. So, I mean, as modern readers today, how impressed should we be with the growth and influence of the US Post in the mid to late 19th century? You even bring it a little bit into the early 20th century. Should we be impressed by what was accomplished during these decades?
Well, I can tell you that just as we maybe take the Post for granted today, 19th century Americans did as well, which I actually thought was a really telling insight into just how widespread and important this institution was. It's almost like when people stop thinking about it explicitly is when you realize that it has become embedded in everyone's lives to that extent.
Because it's just faded into the background of their life, and it's just
Exactly,
something that's just
exactly.
always there.
Right. And so similar to today, right? The only times you think about the Post usually are as if something is, delayed in transit, or, lost or something like that, right? When something goes wrong, you don't think about all of the thousands of times that you do receive mail quite quickly and efficiently and reliably. That's the same thing for the 1800s. I open up the book with what I found to be, maybe going back to your original opening here, in some ways a very boring letter. And this is a letter written by a government official who'd been kind of going on a tour and had visited an Indian reservation, and then had returned to his office in St. Paul, Minnesota. And this was in the middle of the Civil War. And he writes a letter that is half a page long. It's a couple sentences. And basically the entirety of the letter is saying, hey, I left my coat while I was, visiting you guys. Feel free to keep it. And that's it. There was nothing else. There was no official business. There was no anything, even a discussion of the weather, right? And he was able to send this 400 miles kind of through, the outskirts of a lot of settlements here, arriving at this Indian reservation there. And that's it, right? And I think that's really telling that Americans then were completely able to send what I kind of describe almost as the equivalent of a text message, right? After the day after maybe a party or something where you left your coat there. But this isn't the 21st century. This is the middle of the Civil War in the 1860s. And I think that is so telling about the degree to which this network has connected people fairly seamlessly in areas of the country that you really wouldn't expect, and are actually quite challenging to maintain that network. But despite that, people are able to use it without a second thought.
So when did the United States make this transition from an earlier era where it was expensive and potentially slow, or even maybe unreliable, but where if you're writing a letter, you have to think carefully about every word because you pay, for how many pages it was or how heavy it was. Like, when did they make the transition then where they can just shoot off a text saying, hey, go ahead and keep that coat, to someone, hundreds of miles away? I mean, out on the frontier, not like in a heavily populated or an area with lots of infrastructure. When does this transition happen?
So it's an interesting shift, but I would say that it really does start in some ways with the very founding of the country, when the government officials basically dedicated themselves to providing a fairly accessible postal service to connect the country. And this is, at a time when there's 13 states kind of hugging the Atlantic seaboard. And as the historian Richard John has written in a very influential book, the U.S. Post really was the connective tissue for this founding era all the way through the 1850s that early Americans really used to stay abreast of politics, news. This was a super crucial institution. Now that starts to get a little more challenging in the second half of the 1800s when you face, what do you do with a country that's not just 13 states along the Atlantic Ocean, but is a continental nation spanning all the way out to the Pacific coast. And that's when you see the shift in the network. They still have this kind of commitment to providing a fairly universal system and service. It's a public service. But you run into all sorts of challenges of geography that the West imposes. And so there's a couple shifts that take place. One is a dramatic reduction in postage rates, specifically for writing something like letters. And they're following the model of actually the British postal system, which instituted it earlier. And so they drop the amount of postage that you pay. And in response, Americans start writing more and more and more letters, right? They become very, very active letter writers. We have a fairly high literacy rate in the United States. And then the second one is that in the early 1860s, the U.S. Post, or Congress, actually ends up getting rid of distance as a factor in determining postage. And that is in response, again, to having this massive, country. Before, if a letter traveled farther, you paid more. And that is very much still the way for private private sorts of transportation, right? But for the U.S. Post, it's a public service. And now that we have a continental nation, they basically decide, you know what? We're going to charge the exact same rate for someone sending a letter from New York to San Francisco that we are from New York to Newark. And that opens up all sorts of kind of possibilities for Westerners to be able to use this system. So I'd say that's the kind of shift that's happening with this massive territorial expansion in the West kind of through the 1850s and the early 1860s.
So is this a chicken or the egg situation? Is it this rapid continental westward expansion that leads to these these new developments or revisions of the postal system, or is it the postal system that allows for the westward expansion? Or I mean, that obviously they're happening concurrently, but as you look at that transition period, are there moments where it wasn't working, where there were discussions saying, "Oh, if we don't fix or make the postal system work differently, westward expansion isn't going to work"? Or from the other direction, are there people saying, westward expansion has already happened and the postal system isn't working? So how is that debate going on in the moment?
I think what's really interesting to me is that the degree to which Americans in the 19th century had a working assumption that the postal system, again, by the 1860s or so, really was almost kind of like a birthright of living in the United States and having access to the mail, and having access to the mail that's affordable and easy to get was kind of baked into people's assumptions. There was not really any talk about, privatization or inefficiency or any of these kind of things that might come up later in the 20th century. In the 1800s, this was the most expansive communications network, and people just assumed that it would continue to be so, even with this massive kind of territorial expansion. So occasionally you get congressional debates where some representatives or senators that live in more densely settled New England states, for instance, might grumble a little bit about the cost of providing mail to some distant mining camp in Idaho. But generally speaking, no one is going to touch the Post because it's such a popular institution amongst their constituents. So their constituents want to have the mail, and no one really cares about the idea of like the U.S. Post having to kind of pay for itself. That's a much, much more recent assumption that we have developing again in the 1900s. In the 1800s, this idea of efficiency didn't really exist yet.
But so if someone goes and moves off to, remote Idaho, mining camp, with that they weren't like fretting over, oh, but now I won't be able to get mail anymore. It was just kind of assumed it would happen. Not whereas like if they move up there, they maybe say, well, we're going to be really far away from a rail line. That wasn't expected to be infrastructure immediately provided, but the post was. So that's a very different dynamic. Um, you talk about the post as being a form or a conduit for state power and for expanding state power across the continent. I think when we think about federal power moving across the West, we think about forts, the military. Sometimes we talk about the railroad and kind of everything that comes in the wake of infrastructure. And I've talked about all those things with my students, but the post is not part of that conversation. At least I don't think I've taught it that way. So what are the ways in which the expansion of the post brings state power with it to the frontier and beyond?
I think it's important to try to remember this different era of American governance in the 1800s. I think this is really crucial. Today, we have certain, or at least I should say, I have certain conceptions of what the federal government is, and in a lot of ways, we kind of interact with the federal government in all sorts of different ways, or state governments, or that kind of much more bureaucratic, top-down, large organizations that are just kind of part of American society and life in 2022. In the 1800s, really for a lot of people, especially if you lived in rural areas, the federal government did not have a major presence there. And for most Americans, the primary interaction that you had with the federal government was through your local post office. And this is where it starts to look very different from today. I don't know about you, but when I go to the post office, right, it's almost always a standalone building of some kind. You walk inside, there's, a couple people working there with USPS uniforms on. And it's a fairly, stable kind of setup. In the 1800s, going to the post office for most people that didn't live in big cities involved walking not to a post office building, but to your local general store and asking the store owner if you had any letters, because this system was essentially grafted onto an existing private infrastructure. And rather than having these standalone post office buildings, the government would pay a local store owner or other person there to pass out letters in their place of business for $50 a year, something like that. And then the mail was transported not in official U.S. Post vehicles or anything like that, but it was a contract that was given to a private stagecoach company. They would toss a sack of mail in the back of their stagecoach alongside their freight or passengers. And so it was this much more flexible kind of form of government power that I think makes it a lot less recognizable, or at least harder to see as a form of government power. But by mapping out all this stuff, by looking at how Americans were using the mail, you start to understand just how important it was. And to go back to what we were talking about earlier, if you're a miner who decides to go to the mountainous region of Idaho, you go there fully expecting to be able to send letters back to your family in Ohio, or subscribe to newspapers and magazines and stay current with political affairs or commercial developments. If you're a store owner or another business person, you are using the mail to send invoices or receipts or mortgages. All sorts of kind of financial instruments that we don't think about are taking place at a distance through the mail. And the ability of the post and the government to extend those lines of communication, again, we take for granted, they took for granted. That doesn't make it any less important.
Yeah, it's just maybe not as visible, but it serves as it facilitates so many things, right? So even if we say, like, if we think about a military post, in a fort as the face of state power out on the frontier, that military post is only able to operate and keep things going because it has dependable communication networks through the post. Or some far-flung remote settlement, you can go and farm out there, but it may not be very livable long term without the post there supporting. So it facilitates so many things in westward expansion and development. Um, you mentioned how a lot of postal employees, I mean, we talk about, yeah, like, postal employees today, but then there were very few, especially at least, out at the local level, full-time U.S. postal workers, right? It was, you described it, this is an agency model where they contract out with private citizens, be it a general store owner or someone, doing a stagecoach or something. What were the advantages of that model rather than just hiring full-time federal employees all over the country? What were the advantages of that? And what were some of the costs or the problems that came with that model?
So I think the benefits and costs really do go hand in hand. And one of the main benefits, especially in the Western United States, is that it's really, really easy to get that infrastructure up and running if you are not building, new buildings or dispatching government-run, carriages or anything like that. Again, instead, you're just taking the existing infrastructure that's there, the existing workforce and people, and just kind of hitching it onto that. And so that meant that what I was always struck by was how easy it was to get a post office or a mail route to your community. And there was no kind of official form that people would fill out and check boxes. The U.S. Post is not going to send an official from Washington to go over the route and make sure that it actually makes sense to have something there. Instead, you just gather up a petition of signatures. You'd send it to your local politicians, your congresspeople in Washington, or the post office department itself. And then overwhelmingly, they'd approve the request and then commission a local store owner to, again, start distributing letters, contract with a stagecoach company to start carrying the mail. And so this meant that people could get this mail service so quickly in shockingly remote areas. And that's the part that always kind of blows my mind, again, is that you can really quickly move into parts of the West that are, at least in the contiguous United States, some of the least accessible parts of the country. And in not waiting for a railroad line certainly is not going to get there, but you're still able to get your mail very quickly. The downside of this is that this is also a very unstable system. Especially in the Western United States that are dependent on mining, other kinds of extractive industries. These communities are popping up, and then a lot of them are disappearing very quickly. And so the post is also fairly unstable as well, which in some ways can be an advantage. It allows it to kind of contract from these places as well. But this comes with the double-edged sword that it is also a very kind of unregulated network, in the sense that, central administrators in Washington, they just do not have the workforce or the capacity to oversee on-the-ground operations in tens of thousands of places across the country. And so they're relying on these private actors to be fulfilling public functions. And it actually works fairly well, but it does lead to some lack of oversight, which might not be surprising. Things like corruption, for instance. One of the chapters in my book deals with a whole instance of corruption in the contracting division, where stagecoach companies would start using these kind of fraudulent bidding processes to win government mail contracts, then inflate those contracts. There were oftentimes, hundreds of thousands of dollars, very lucrative contracts. They would bribe politicians to kind of influence or lobby the Post to get these. So there's kind of understandable and maybe not surprising downsides of this as well.
I mean, and at the local store, there's, I don't know if I'll call it corruption, but that local store owner, by accepting this contract, right, it gives a steady amount of income, which is always nice. But there are other benefits that they receive then, which could be leveraged towards corrupt purposes or growing one's personal power in the community. Explain that dynamic for us, because it also helps explain why would a store owner accept this new responsibility.
So at a local level, this arrangement where commissioning a store owner to pass out letters means that whoever holds that position of postmaster in a community means that people have to come to their place of business whenever they want to send or receive mail. And so you're getting a steady stream of customers coming into your store, for instance, which kind of answers this puzzle that I always had, which is, why did 19th century Americans care so much about things like who was the postmaster or where the post office was located? Because these positions were not lucrative. Again, you're getting paid, 50 bucks, $100 a year. These are not money-making kind of positions, and yet people would fight over them constantly. And if you read the letters of any national politician, you see them just complaining all the time about having to adjudicate these local disputes about who's going to be the local postmaster in a town. And again, the reason for this is because of the central function of a post office in a community as a gathering place, as people having to kind of regularly come in, a place of news, gossip. If you are the postmaster, you also know where all your neighbors and customers are subscribing to, probably what political parties they're part of. So there's all sorts of benefits that come from this position that aren't necessarily financial, which means that people, again, fought over who got to be postmaster. And this is where this element of political patronage really comes into play as well, and that these were highly politicized positions. And all of this kind of stemmed from the fact that the US Post was part of the executive branch of the federal government. And so that meant that whenever the presidency changed hands between different parties, you would get this mass exodus of postmasters across the country. So say Republicans were in power, they appoint a bunch of local Republican store owners as postmasters. Democrats win an election, come into power, and they immediately remove a bunch of those same postmasters and install Democratic store owners as postmasters. And so there's these huge kind of shifts of not just the infrastructure itself, but who's operating the infrastructure as well. That means it's very, very unstable. I was kind of blown away when you look at some of the data. The turnover rate of these government positions was phenomenal. You'd have people serving a couple months, a year or two, next election cycle would come in, they'd leave, someone else would come in, the post office would move down the street to a different store. So it's a really almost chaotic kind of arrangement as well for thinking about these advantages and disadvantages.
Did so people were very interested and very aware of who their postmaster was. And I mean, you write about how just the shocking number of complaints that are being sent into the federal government, like about like local postmasters. So they're aware of the post in that sense. But then does their awareness or their thinking critically about how the post works, like once it gets beyond their little settlement, is it just kind of out of sight, out of mind? Like the broader network and how it works?
It is to an extent, but I will say what's also interesting again is that the US Post was, as it remains today, actually one of the most popular public institutions in the country. And of course, people would grumble about, delayed letters or missing, deliveries or something like that. But again and again, Americans upheld the US Post as kind of a model of what active federal government could do for society. And the Populist Party, so this kind of agrarian, rural-based political movement in the 1890s that advocated for stronger government regulation and control of things like the railroad industry or the telegraph industry, they explicitly put in their party platform the US Post as the model for what they thought the federal government should do across these other sectors, because the US Post, again, was a universal public service and public good. It didn't kind of quote unquote discriminate on the basis of distance or how far away or how rural your area was. You just paid the same 2 cents on a letter to send it thousands of miles potentially. And so it was a really popular institution at that level. While at the same time, similar to today, most people never really thought about, the kind of remarkable nature of being able to address an envelope to the name of your cousin in San Francisco, let's say, and then the letter showing up there 4 days later and them able to get it.
Yeah, it's remarkable that, yeah, how well the system worked, but it didn't work easily. It took a lot. So the government kind of made this promise or built this expectation that, yeah, wherever you go, you're going to have cheap, easy, efficient access to the post. But actually making that happen, especially as we get farther west and settlement gets more remote is very difficult. Yeah, they address that one way, as we already mentioned, through just contracting out to private local people. You talk a lot also about maps and how they are just constantly scrambling to keep track of these towns and post offices. They come and go. So how do they do this? How does post office mapping, how can they ever keep up with the boom and bust, right? This boom and bust cycle of a town pops up and 6 months later it's gone. And who knows where all the residents have gone.
The short answer is they don't, or at least they try very hard to, but continually struggle. And so starting in the 1860s, a new division within the post office department is a mapping division. And it's a kind of shoestring operation. It's basically one guy and then a bunch of map makers. And they're trying to map the entire postal network, which at that time is, 35,000 post offices roughly. And as we've talked about, those post offices could disappear at a moment's notice, or the mail route might change, or it might shift locations. Their names changed constantly. And so if you're trying to think of a central administrator or map maker in Washington, D.C., just trying to get your handle on all this, I mean, it's hard to even take a single snapshot of what it looks like at any given time, much less keep those maps current every year as it's adding thousands of new post offices while 1,000 more are being discontinued or changing locations. Despite that, they really do accomplish a fair amount. And I think it's also speaks to just the level of geographic uncertainty during this time. Today, right, we're so used to being able to pull up our phones and look at Google Maps and know where everything is at all times. And that was not the case in the late 1800s, especially in the Western United States. And so you saw them struggling to even identify where is a post office, because it's not like they're sending out a map maker to, again, some mountainous region of Idaho. Instead, they're relying on postmasters themselves to send in reports about where their office is located. And as you might expect, if you're a busy store owner who's doing this as a totally part-time gig, a lot of those postmasters never replied or didn't really take the time to answer it fully. And so, again, you see this kind of tension between this vast, sprawling network that is serving so many different Americans, but some of the challenges that come from trying to administer that network from its center in Washington, D.C.
So at any given moment, the moment that a map is completed, it's likely already inaccurate or out of date, right? Like major hubs don't change. But the farther out you get, like in these little capillaries, right? There was never quite a fully accurate map.
Correct. It's definitely there's a built-in obsolescence to these maps, but despite that, they're also some of the only sources of comprehensive information about where all these different towns were. And so you saw congressmen, for instance, so hungry for getting these maps, and oftentimes the post office department would distribute these maps across the federal government, because in many cases they were the most accurate and up-to-date information about, if you had a local district, where all those places were, how often the mail was getting delivered to them, what kind of routes connected them, kind of basic information like that, again, we take for granted, was in fairly short supply at the time.
I mean, this discussion of these connections between the federal government back east, far-flung Western settlements, kind of leads directly to the last two chapters of your book, where you're talking about ways in which the post office leads to this far-flung, continental empire becoming integrated and tied together. And this was part of, Jefferson's and others' concern all along. Can we have, a continental republic? And Jefferson, yeah, agrarian republic, yeoman farmers, all that stuff. But national integration is a real concern the farther out things get. You do, in the last two chapters, one is on money orders, and you use that to talk about integrating far-flung places with national economies and markets. And then you also talk about rural free delivery, which brings us into the early 20th century. So maybe let's first talk about the money order idea. How does the ability of making long distance purchases how has that revolutionized through the money order system versus, say, perhaps 50 years earlier, if you wanted to purchase something on the other side of the country, uh, you had a much riskier proposition. So what's the change here?
And again, I think it's helpful for us to, pause and just think about all the modern day assumptions that we might have in 2022, right? That I can, go onto a website of a store or the New York Times or another publication, give them my credit card info, and boom, you have a transaction completed. Whereas doing these kinds of long distance transactions in the 1800s, especially in the Western United States, was quite challenging, in part because the nation's money supply was fairly, unstable in rural areas, the West and the South in particular. And if you were sending cash or specie through the mail, there's always the chance that it would get lost or stolen in transit. And so starting in the 1860s, the US Post began to offer a money order service. And this actually stemmed out of the Civil War, when Union soldiers were trying to send, parts of their wages back home to family members, and complaining that they couldn't rely on the mail to do so. They were worried about, things getting stolen. And so the US Post developed a system where you could go to your local post office, let's say, give them $10. The postmaster would fill out a form about who you were sending that money to. They'd send the form through the mail without the $10. And then at the recipient's post office, they'd go to their local postmaster and get $10 back. And so it's this kind of almost a small scale checking system. It was only for small transactions. This wasn't, you're not going to use this to complete major purchases. But as they started to offer that service to more and more locations, Americans jumped at it. And Westerners in particular were really hungry for this service. Again, if you were living, let's say, in a distant part of the West, but wanted to subscribe to a magazine based out of Chicago, you could subscribe to that using a money order and send, $3 through the mail and then get that magazine back. And so they started to use this system, again, to reliably do these kind of small scale, oftentimes commercial transactions that were beyond the local scale. And so it became this really important commercial integration system across the Western United States. And I think what's really interesting about this particular system and the way it progressed was that, compared to, again, this more kind of bottom-up, free-for-all network that develops about, submitting a petition and getting a post office very easily, this was much more of a top-down, centrally administered system. And there's this lifelong bureaucrat named Charles McDonald in the post office department who is in charge of this network. And he's much more careful about where they're going to start to offer this service. And they're only going to do it in places that can kind of reliably have cash on hand, are able to conduct these transactions more reliably. And that means that it's much more constrained. It's not as widespread. It's not a universal service. And it really doesn't become so until the very end of the century into the 20th century. So that's the kind of postal money order side of things. And then starting around the same time in the 1890s, you see a new service being experimented with by postal administrators called rural free delivery, RFD. And again, it's important to remember that unless you lived in a big city, for most Americans, you had to walk to your local post office to get the mail. It's not like the system we have today. Rural free delivery is when that changed. That started to offer this delivery of the mail directly to, the doorstep of your house or the mailbox at the end of your driveway. And it was kind of halting at first. It took a while for it to take off, but it totally reshaped mail service in rural parts of the country. And so for the first time, if you're a farmer living in rural Nebraska, let's say, you're able to get catalogs delivered to your house that you can then use to buy appliances or farm equipment. And so there's much more of this kind of connective tissue that's developing through rural free delivery. At the same time, it's also causing tens of thousands of post offices to shut down over the course of several decades, because you don't need one post office that's within a couple miles of everyone's house anymore. And so you see this big shift in the network taking place in the early 1900s with the slow rollout of rural free delivery.
It's interesting that a lot of this stuff is taking place at a very small scale, or kind of just the day-to-day life. You say they're not using money orders to, do enormous commercial financial transactions, but to subscribe to a magazine from Chicago, which on its surface we might say, oh, that doesn't seem as important, but it's the buildup of all those small little things. That's what fills most of our life, right, and determines our identity, our connection with uh, where we live and other places as well. So I think that's really, I think we can't understate in both of these, the money orders and the rural free delivery, that this is really transforming people's day-to-day life and connecting it to a broader American experience, right? This is where we start talking sometimes about some cultural homogenization, where if you live in that guy in rural Nebraska, someone in San Francisco, someone in a mining camp in Idaho, uh, they may all be using the same Sears and Roebuck catalog and ordering the same pair of pants. Am I overstating the influence that the Post has in this kind of cultural homogenization or growth of a shared American experience?
I don't think so. And it's something I kind of wrestled with in writing this book and trying to make this argument is that, on the one hand, I really don't want to overstate the kind of causal role of the Post, right? People aren't moving into rural Nebraska because of the Post. They're not becoming more culturally homogenized because of the Post. What it is doing is providing a kind of underlying infrastructure that facilitates some of these larger processes, I think, in really underappreciated ways. And, it's much easier for us to fixate on the really visible forms that these are taking with discounting just the basic fact of being able to communicate at a distance, and how easily you can communicate at a distance can really shape some of these other processes that are taking place at the time, which is a hard argument to make, right? It's not kind of flashy, it's not intuitive, and I was hoping that this, again, pairing up some of these large spatial patterns and geographical approaches to studying the network with this more, as you say, lived day-to-day reality, mundane interactions that are taking place, helps convey just how it all works and the importance of this overarching structure.
I mean, you demonstrate this most clearly with your, I think it's in the second chapter with this family of orphans who, over the course of decades, you trace their moving all around the West, and they're in constant communication with one another. And one of them moves somewhere, and the others follow, and then they go back to where they were. But it's that the maintaining of those family ties for these four orphans uh, is possible because of the Post, because they can talk with each other as they're moving all over the place. So I mean, that's a real, that was a real vivid kind of demonstration of that dynamic. Well, we are probably about out of time. Uh, what a last question: what are you hoping that historians of the West, or even just general Westerners, what's the big takeaway that you want us to walk away from your book with?
I think it's an appreciation of two things, really. One is geography itself. I think, anyone who lives in the West is probably aware, but geography of the West is quite different from the rest of the country. And the ability to live in relatively distant or isolated or spread out areas depends on all sorts of connections that then run through those areas as well. And so that's the second piece, which is to really appreciate, or at least have a curiosity about, some of those networks, structures, connections that I think shape all of our lives, but we never seem to really notice or appreciate in some ways. And I think, it's hard not to think about the role of something like social media today, or all sorts of digital connections that are structuring our lives for better or for worse. And I think it's important for us to understand some of the history, or at least historical precedents behind this connective tissue, and to study and understand kind of how these things came into being, and again, the ways in which they really do shape our lived experience.
That's great. Do you want to give us any insight into what you're working on next?
Oh, I've completely shifted gears in a certain sense. I'm actually working on a collaborative project with Annalise Hines, Dr. Annalise Hines, who's a professor at the University of Oregon. And we are doing a history of lesbian community formation in the 1970s and 1980s. And we're doing a kind of mapping project looking at the geography of the lesbian community at this time, and then some of the connections between these areas that were taking place through alternative lesbian press. And so again, totally different time period. It's been really fun for me to learn about something new, but also applying some of these same mapping approaches that I've been doing as well. So it's been really great.
Well, that's awesome. Well, there's no shortage of new topics that will be new to you that these mapping and digital skills could be applied to. So I think over the next few decades, we might see you popping up in all kinds of unexpected places, which is great. Well, I really appreciate your time, Cameron, and congrats on the book. And thanks for having a discussion with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been really fun, and I'm a fan of the podcast. So keep up the good work.
Great. All right. Well, take care. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, or follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast, or on Twitter at Writing West, where you can get updates and leave comments. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We're an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understandings about the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream, have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product can apply. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD Center. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. Find him at Micah Dahl Dahl Anderson with an O.com. I'll put a link in the episode description. My name is Brendan Rensink. I serve as the podcast host, producer, and just about everything else, so you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm author and editor of a number of books on the West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. Recently, my book, Native But Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, published by Texas A&M University Press in 2018, won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. In an anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen entitled Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, published by the University of Utah Press in 2019, won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also general editor and project manager of a great digital history, public history project named Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written microhistories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's RENSINK.org, or follow me on Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, and be kind. Cheers.